Sebastiana Coton Vasquez. There is a phrase American prosecutors used to describe her, and it has stuck to her name ever since. They called her a woman who should be feared because she had the ability to make a lot of things happen. By the time they said it, she was sitting in a United States courtroom, having moved an estimated 60 tons of cocaine across Central America over 15 years. And the strangest part is where she started. Because Sebastiana Coton Vasquez did not come from money or power or a criminal dynasty. She came from nothing at all. She was born around 1955 in Malacatan, a town in San Marcos that sits right on the line where Guatemala bleeds into Mexico. Her childhood was brutal in ways that were common for the poorest families in that region, and devastating all the same. She left school at 10 years old. At 18, she was abducted by a man who would go on to father her children. That was the whole of her early life. No education, no safety, no path forward that anyone would have recognized as promising. What she did have was geography. Malacatan sat directly on a smuggling corridor, and around the year 2000, cotton started working it. She began buying cocaine from the Lorenzana family, one of Guatemala's most entrenched trafficking clans. In 2001, she was paying around $5,000 per kilo. By 2011, that price had climbed to $12,000. She was not muscle. She was not a street dealer. She was a broker, the person who connected the people who had product with the people who could move it north. And the network she plugged into was enormous. She dealt with Nicaragua's Los Charros, with the Valle clan over in Honduras, with Colombian suppliers, and with the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. When the Guatemalan trafficker known as Chamalay was captured in 2011 and extradited 3 years later, Cotton essentially inherited the structure he left behind. By then, international authorities were accusing her of pushing roughly 40 tons of United States-bound cocaine through the region. In her own court testimony, she put the number even higher, closer to 60 tons over the length of her career. To understand how unusual that was, you have to picture the world she was operating in. The Guatemalan border zone in those years was not a place where women gave orders. It was a landscape of armed men, of clans that settled disputes with massacres, of trafficking families who had ruled for generations. And into that world walked a woman with barely any schooling and no protection of her own, who somehow made herself indispensable to all of them. She did it by being reliable. When Sebastiana Coton said a shipment would move, it moved. That's not a typo, by the way. 60 tons. For years, she operated in the open spaces of the border. A woman in her 50s running a logistics operation that fed the largest drug pipeline in the hemisphere. But the same network that gave her reach also made her visible. As the bigger players around her started falling, the people hunting them began drawing lines back to the broker in Malacatan. The end came on October 8, 2014. Cotton fled across the Suchiate River, the muddy stretch of water that separates Guatemala from Mexico, and was arrested in Tapachula, in the Mexican state of Chiapas. Mexican authorities flew her to Mexico City, handed her over to Guatemala, and from there she was extradited to the United States. She had spent her whole life on that border. In the end, it could not hide her. In 2015, she pleaded guilty to conspiracy to distribute cocaine and was sentenced to 17 years. But the more revealing part of her case was not the sentence. It was what she did next. In March of 2016, she walked into a United States courtroom and testified against the Lorenzana brothers, Eliu and Waldemar, the same family she had once bought her product from. Her testimony helped put them away for life. As a cooperating witness, her own sentence was quietly reduced, and she was released from American custody around late September of 2019, after roughly 5 years. What that testimony cost her is hard to overstate. In the world she came from, informing on a family like the Lorenzanas is a decision that follows a person for the rest of their life. The brothers she testified against were men with long reaches, and her words helped seal them in American prisons until they die. She had spent a decade and a half building relationships with the most dangerous people in Central America. In a single courtroom appearance, she burned every one of those bridges to the ground. She went home. As far as anyone could tell, she returned to Malacatan, the border town where she had started with nothing. But her past was not finished with her. In January of 2025, Guatemala's public prosecutor's office asked a court to seize around $80,000 in assets they tied to her trafficking, with a hearing set for early February. The woman who had moved tons of cocaine was now fighting over the equivalent of a single bad month for her old operation. She is one kind of woman in this story, the one who built an empire from the absolute bottom. The next one started from a place you would never expect a drug lord to come from. She was a lawyer, Luz Irene Fajardo Campos. She had a law degree. She came from a farming family in rural Sinaloa. She studied, she qualified, and she could have spent her life arguing cases in a courtroom. Instead, she built one of the most sophisticated drug trafficking organizations Mexico had produced in years, and the people who finally caught her did something I want you to sit with. To punish her for going to trial, they murdered her sons. Luz Irene Fajardo Campos was 57 when an American judge sentenced her. She was from Culiacan, the capital of Sinaloa, and the spiritual home of the cartel that bears the state's name. She grew up near Cosala, in an agricultural family, and she trained as a lawyer. That detail matters, because almost nothing about how she ran her organization looked like the work of a street criminal. It looked like the work of someone who understood systems. Her operation ran from roughly 2010 to 2016. Prosecutors were careful to say she was aligned with the Sinaloa cartel, but not formally part of it, which made her unusual. She had her own organization. She sourced cocaine directly from Colombia, employed pilots, and brokered the purchase of jets to fly product into Central America and Mexico. She imported the precursor chemicals to make methamphetamine and ran a lab out in the desert outside Hermosillo. At trial, prosecutors showed cocaine kilos that had been stamped with a brand name, Genka, the way a legitimate company would mark its goods. It is worth pausing on what that lab actually represented. Running methamphetamine production in the open desert outside Hermosillo meant managing chemists, paying for security, organizing the smuggling of precursor chemicals from abroad, and living with the constant risk that rivals or soldiers might stumble onto the site. This was not a woman who inherited a finished operation and coasted on it. She built the thing herself, piece by piece, from the sourcing in Colombia to the jets in the air to the products stamped and boxed for the American market. And like cotton, she understood that the real currency in this world was not drugs. It was influence. She paid bribes to law enforcement in both Mexico and Colombia. She went further than that. She tried to bribe officials into arresting her rivals, using the police themselves as a weapon against the competition. For a while it worked. Then the people hunting her caught up. She was first charged by American authorities in May of 2015, and in April of 2017 she was arrested at the international airport in Bogotá, trying to board a flight to Mexico City. She was extradited to the United States to stand trial. Now here is where most traffickers make a calculation. They cooperate. They plead. They give up names in exchange for a softer landing. Cotton did exactly that. Fajardo Campos did the opposite. She fought. After her arrest, her 2 adult sons were abducted in Hermosillo and murdered. their bodies dismembered and burned. The message was not subtle. It was widely understood as a warning, a way of telling her exactly what cooperation would cost. Her defense lawyer later said that she sacrificed herself by going to trial because of what had been done to her children. She went to trial anyway. In December of 2019, after a 7-day jury trial, she was convicted. The judge who presided over that trial was Ketanji Brown Jackson, then sitting on the Federal District Court in Washington, years before she would join the Supreme Court of the United States. On July 27, 2021, Fajardo Campos was sentenced to 22 years in prison, ordered to serve 5 years of supervised release afterward, and forced to forfeit $18 million. The agents who took her down did not soften their language. The lead DEA official in Phoenix said that with this sentencing, they had cut the head off the snake, and that traffickers like Fajardo Campos tear at the very fabric of communities. A senior Justice Department official described how she had imported huge quantities of cocaine and methamphetamine into the United States, bribing foreign police every step of the way. 22 years for a woman of 57 is in practical terms a life sentence. She would be approaching 80 before she had any real chance of walking free. And she had arrived at that point not by getting caught off guard, but by deliberately choosing to fight a case she could have softened after the people she was fighting had already taken her children from her. What the official statements left out was the human wreckage underneath the case. Court documents noted that her mental health deteriorated badly in custody. She had lost her sons. She had refused to bend. And she had still gone down for 22 years. There was no version of this where she walked away whole. She remains incarcerated in the United States today, a trained lawyer who chose the cartel over the courtroom and paid for that choice with almost everything she had. She built her power on logic and chemistry. The woman who comes next built hers on something far more direct. She built it on a body count. Melissa Calderon Ojeda. She went by La China, and at her peak she ran a paramilitary organization of more than 300 people across the tourist beaches of Baja California Sur. Authorities have linked her to more than 150 killings during a 4-year war that turned places like Los Cabos into battlegrounds. And when police finally captured her, the coded phrase they used over the radio to confirm it was almost gentle. The dove has fallen. Melissa Margarita Calderon Ojeda was born on August 12, 1984. She came up inside the machinery of the Sinaloa cartel, joining its armed wing in 2005, a unit known as the Special Forces of Los Damaso. By 2008, she was leading the sicarios, the cartel's hitmen, across La Paz and Los Cabos. She was in her early 20s and already commanding killers in one of the most violent organizations on Earth. Then, in 2014, she was pushed aside. The cartel demoted her in favor of a man, and that man allegedly killed her partner. So she did what almost no one in that world dares to do. She broke away and built her own organization from scratch, the Cartel California Sur, with a new partner serving as her second in command. What followed was a war. Her group reportedly grew past 300 members, and the death toll climbed into territory that is hard to even process. She is linked to an estimated 150 killings, with some accounts putting the number as high as 180. In just over a year, between July of 2014 and September of 2015, more than 130 people died in the region she was fighting over. She was known for kidnapping, for torture, for dismembering victims as a form of intimidation. At one point, she threatened to ally with Los Zetas, one of the most savage cartels Mexico has ever seen, against her former bosses in Sinaloa. To grasp what that did to the region, you have to remember where it was happening. La Paz and Los Cabos are tourist towns, the kind of places where cruise ships dock and honeymooners sip drinks on the sand. Underneath that postcard, Calderon was running a war. Bodies turned up along the resort corridors. Businesses paid protection money or burned. For a stretch of those years, one of Mexico's prettiest coastlines was also one of its deadliest places to live. And somehow, it gets worse. Because what made her nearly impossible to catch was not her army, it was the police. By her own admission later, she had nearly the entire police force of Baja California Sur eating out of her hand through bribes. The people who were supposed to be hunting her were in many cases working for her. She slipped through the net at least 6 times. What finally undid her was the same thing that has undone almost everyone in this story: betrayal. Her second-in-command was arrested in July of 2015 and gave her up in exchange for a reduced sentence. On September 19, 2015, police closed in on her at the airfield in Cabo San Lucas as she tried to flee under a false identity, traveling under a name that was not her own. Her downfall came with a kind of grim symmetry. The same betrayal she had built her power on, turning police and rivals against one another, was the thing that finally caught her. Her second-in-command talked. Other lieutenants fell around the same time, one drawing 9 years and 8 months, another close to 12 years. The organization she had assembled from nothing came apart in a matter of months. When they took her, the officer relaying the news used that coded phrase, "The dove has fallen." The woman who had commanded hundreds of killers reportedly wept. She said she was tired. She admitted that she had owned the local police, that they had been hers to direct. After years of being the most feared person in the region, she was suddenly just a woman in handcuffs, exhausted, confessing how completely she had corrupted everything around her. Her case ground through the Mexican system for years. Then, on May 2, 2024, state authorities in Baja California Sur confirmed she had been sentenced to 20 years for aggravated homicide, tied to a single killing in January of 2015. And that is one of the quiet, maddening truths of cases like hers. She is linked to more than 150 deaths. The conviction that holds her is for one. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Not the police she paid, not the officials who looked away, not until the war had already buried more than 100 people. Today she is held in the prison at La Paz, returned there after a legal ruling moved her from a federal women's facility, locked inside the same state she once tried to rule by force. She fought a war for territory she could touch. The last woman in this stretch of the story fought for something else entirely. She fought for power inside the system itself, and she became famous not for what she did, but for how many times she escaped. Marixa Lemus. They call her the female Chapo, but not for the reason you would assume. She was not running a transnational drug empire. She earned that nickname the way the original El Chapo earned half his legend, by walking out of prison. She broke out of a Guatemalan military prison dressed as a guard. She was eventually convicted across 4 separate cases, and her sentences stacked up to more than 145 years. And it all began with a feud over a small-town mayor's office. Marixa Ethelinda Lemus Perez was Guatemalan, and she was not, despite the nickname, the head of a drug cartel. What she led was a kidnapping and assassination network, a murder-for-hire operation with cross-border ties. It is a smaller and uglier thing than a drug cartel, more personal, more intimate in its violence. Salvadoran police described her as a bridge between Central American traffickers, but her real business was fear. Her crew was staffed in part by 6 former officers from Guatemala's National Civil Police. the very people meant to stop crews like hers. It is worth being precise about what Marixa Lemus actually was, because the female Chapo label has flattened her story into something it never was. She was not moving cocaine by the ton across continents. She was a regional operator whose weapons were kidnapping, intimidation, and murder for hire. With just enough connection to Salvadoran trafficking structures to make her dangerous on both sides of the border. The legend came from her escapes. The reality was uglier, smaller, and far more personal than the nickname suggests. She was also, improbably, a politician. She ran for mayor of Moyuta in the department of Jutiapa, and the engine of her entire criminal story was a political feud with the man who held that office. That feud turned catastrophic in 2011, when her sister Mera was assassinated in a massacre that killed 7 people. After that, the violence around Lemus stopped being abstract and became a settling of scores. The charges that eventually buried her read like a campaign of terror: kidnapping, conspiracy to murder, attempted murder, illicit association. In November of 2013, her network kidnapped and killed one of her own relatives, a woman named Amanda Lemus, demanding a ransom of $30,000 before the victim's body was found. The following month, December of 2013, the group attempted to bomb the mayor she had been feuding with. She was captured in April of 2014, and that should have been the end of the story. It was barely the beginning, because Marixa Lemus would not stay in prison. In May of 2016, she escaped from the Santa Teresa Women's Prison, though she was recaptured within minutes in a wooded area nearby. That was the warm-up. On May 11, 2017, she staged the escape that made her famous. She walked out of the Mariscal Zavala military prison disguised as a prison guard. A military prison. She was on the run for 14 days before she was recaptured across the border in Ahuachapan, El Salvador. Her hair dyed blonde in an attempt to disappear. Guatemala's interior minister said plainly that she had bleached her hair to try to pass unnoticed. And no, I'm not making that up. The fallout from that single escape was enormous. The director of the entire prison system was fired. 8 guards were arrested. So were the warden and her own lawyer. One woman, walking out dressed as a guard, brought down the leadership of a national prison system. When they brought her back in, she was defiant. She demanded to be treated like a human being and not like an animal. She insisted her life was in danger inside prison, that there were people who wanted to harm her. It was the language of someone who still believed she could control the narrative, even in chains. The recapture itself was almost cinematic. 14 days on the run, her hair bleached blonde, finally picked up in the town of Ahuachapan in El Salvador, far from the prison she had strolled out of, dressed as one of its guards. By the time she was back behind Guatemalan walls, she had become a national embarrassment for the state, and to plenty of people watching, something close to a folk legend. The Guatemalan courts made sure she could not. On March 25, 2015, she was sentenced to 94 years and 8 months for leading the criminal band. Later, she received roughly 31 more years for ordering the murder of her own husband in 2014. Then another 10 years for the Mariscal Zavala escape. Stacked together across 4 convictions, her total reached 145 years and 8 months. Her sister, or by some records her cousin, Sonia Lemus, was handed 94 years of her own. She is incarcerated in Guatemala today, held at the Santa Teresa prison in Zone 18, the same kind of facility she once proved she could walk straight out of. The female Chapo is exactly where the system spent 4 trials and 145 years making sure she would stay. For all her audacity, Lemus stayed close to home. The next woman operated on a different scale entirely, moving cocaine by the ton across an entire country, and she did it from inside one of the most powerful crime families in Honduras. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Digna Valle. She was a grandmother, Doña Digna they called her, the matriarch of one of the largest cocaine pipelines in Honduras, a family operation so well connected that El Chapo himself reportedly came to visit their villa in the mountains. She never fired a gun. She never ordered a killing that anyone could pin to her. What she did was move tens of thousands of kilos of cocaine a month, and when she finally fell, she took her own brothers down with her. Digna Azucena Valle was born around 1958 in El Espiritu, in the Honduran department of Copan, right on the Guatemalan border. She was the matriarch of the Valle clan, known simply as Los Valles, a family that ran their corner of Honduras like a private kingdom from the early 1990s onward. Theirs was one of the country's biggest cocaine transport organizations, the crucial bridge between the suppliers coming up from Colombia and Guatemala and the Mexican cartels waiting to carry the product north. And Digna's role was not violence, it was logistics and money. According to court documents, she and her family helped move tens of thousands of kilograms of cocaine every single month, out of Colombia, across Honduras, up into Guatemala, and eventually into the United States. They used speedboats and small airplanes, and when they needed to, they even moved product by submarine. American prosecutors described the Valle organization as responsible for importing multi-ton quantities of cocaine, an operation that relied on violence and public corruption to keep the routes open. The clan controlled their region the way a feudal family controls land. They owned the local officials, they owned the roads, they owned the airstrips, and at the center of the financial machine sat Digna, a woman who managed the flow of money for an empire while presenting to the world as nothing more than a rural Honduran matriarch. For decades, that arrangement was untouchable. The Valles did not need to flee or hide, because in their corner of Copan, they were the law. They decided which planes landed and which roads stayed open. Police, mayors, and military men were either folded into the operation or paid to stay quiet. It was the kind of total local control that most criminal organizations can only dream about, and Digna sat at the financial center of all of it. The first crack in that empire was her. On July 20th, 2014, Digna Valle was arrested at Miami International Airport. She was the first member of the clan to fall. She had been quietly named in an American indictment months earlier, and when she landed on United States soil, the people who had been building a case against the entire family finally had their opening. And here is where Digna made the decision that defines her story. She cooperated, fully. She pleaded guilty, and then she became one of the most valuable witnesses the United States had ever turned inside a Honduran trafficking organization. The information she provided helped capture and extradite her own brothers, Miguel Arnulfo and Luis Alonso Valle, each of whom would go on to serve 23 years in American prison. Her cooperation even led her son to surrender himself to United States authorities. Think about what that means. The matriarch of the family chose to dismantle it from the inside. The United States attorney handling the case described the Valle brothers as leaders of one of the world's largest drug trafficking organizations, men responsible for importing tons of cocaine into the country every year. And it was their own sister who handed prosecutors the keys. Her reward was a relatively light sentence. She served around 4.5 years of an 11-year term and was released in November of 2018. But freedom, for someone in her position, came with a terrible complication. As a foreign national, She faced deportation back to Honduras, and going home was not an option because home was full of people she had betrayed. A former chief of international operations for the DEA put it in the bluntest terms imaginable. He said sending her back to Honduras would be a death sentence, that the country was without question a narco state, and that she was not likely to survive there. So she fought it. She was detained again, held in an immigration facility in Atlanta, and she appealed, citing the threat to her life. So she became something almost unheard of, a Honduran narco matriarch fighting an American immigration court for the right to stay in the United States. The same government that had prosecuted her was now the only thing standing between her and a country where she might not last a week. She had handed them her family. In return, she was asking them to let her vanish quietly on American soil. By the most recent reporting, she avoided deportation and was living quietly in Texas, having sought asylum in the same country she had once flooded with cocaine. The male members of the Valle clan eventually finished their American sentences and returned to Honduras. Digna, the woman who brought the whole thing down, stayed behind, hidden somewhere in the United States, alive precisely because she had turned on her own blood. Digna Valle survived by betraying her family. The next woman survived by never being caught at all. In fact, she may be the only person on this entire list who is still running her empire right now. Enadina Arellano Felix. Almost every woman in this story ends the same way, in a cell, in a courtroom, or in a grave. This one is different. Enadina Arellano Felix has never been arrested. She has never been charged. She has never been convicted of anything in any country. And yet American and Mexican officials believe she is, or was, the first woman to ever lead a major Mexican cartel. The accountant who inherited an empire of blood and then made sure she never paid for it. A note before we go further, because it matters. Unlike the other women here, Enadina has no convictions to her name. Much of what is said about her comes from intelligence assessments, from journalists, and from the songs and films that have turned her into a legend. So everything that follows is what officials and reporters believe, not what a court has ever proven. Keep that in mind. Enadina Arellano Felix was born on April 12, 1961. She was the sister of the brothers who founded the Tijuana Cartel, also known as the Arellano Felix Organization, the group that controlled the lucrative smuggling corridor running from Tijuana into Southern California. But while her brothers became famous for their savagery, Enadina took a different path. She got an education. She earned a degree and trained as an accountant, and that is exactly how she became valuable. In an organization built on violence, she was the financial brain. She is believed to have run the cartel's money laundering operations, washing drug profits through front businesses, including a network of pharmacies. While her brothers spilled blood in the streets of Tijuana, Enadina sat over the books, turning that bloodshed into clean, usable money. Then, one by one, the men around her fell. Her brother Ramon was killed in 2002. Her brother Benjamin was arrested that same year. Francisco Javier was captured in 2006. Eduardo was taken in 2008. The dynasty that had ruled Tijuana was being dismantled piece by piece. And when her nephew, the man known as El Ingeniero, was captured in June of 2014, officials believed there was only one person with the intelligence and the standing to hold the organization together. They believe she stepped up. And here is what makes her so unusual. According to a former DEA official, Enadina was not interested in the wars her brothers had fought. She was interested in alliances and in making money. The theory is that she steered the cartel away from the open slaughter that had made it famous and toward quieter partnerships, including, reportedly, an arrangement with the man who would become the most powerful trafficker in the world, El Chapo Guzman. What makes her so hard to pin down is exactly what made her effective. There are no shootouts tied to her name, no dramatic captures, no courtroom footage. She dealt in spreadsheets and arrangements, in the quiet machinery that keeps an organization solvent. Violence leaves bodies and witnesses. Accounting leaves paper, and paper can be hidden, laundered, and burned. She seems to have understood that the safest place to stand in a cartel was nowhere near the trigger. The only formal action any government has ever taken against her is financial. The United States Treasury named her under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act, the so-called Kingpin List, freezing whatever American assets she might hold and barring Americans from doing business with her. That designation dates back to 2000 and was reaffirmed publicly years later. But a place on a sanctions list is not an arrest, and it is not a conviction. It is a government saying, on paper, that it believes what it cannot yet prove. The DEA has not forgotten her. One official stated flatly that if she is ever found to be conducting drug trafficking activity inside the United States, they will come after her with everything they have. But that is a conditional threat, a promise of what would happen if. As of now, there is no if. There is only her absence. And recently, that absence has started to look less like retirement and more like control. As of early 2026, reporting out of Tijuana suggested that Enadina and her nephew had quietly reasserted command over the old organization and forged new alliances, including with the CJNG, one of the most powerful cartels in Mexico today. But that reporting is journalistic inference, not confirmed by any authority, and her exact whereabouts remain unknown. A great deal of her legend has been built by people who have never met her. She has been turned into a character in narco corridos, the ballads that romanticize cartel figures, and into a template for film and television. The myth and the intelligence have blurred together over the years, until it is genuinely difficult to say where one ends and the other begins. So here she sits, in the strangest position on this entire list. A woman officials call the godmother of a cartel, the first of her kind, the accountant who may still be running an empire from the shadows. There is no mugshot, no trial, no sentence to point to, just a name on a sanctions list and a legend that grows louder every year. Enadina built her power on staying invisible. The next woman built hers on becoming a symbol. The matriarch of an Italian crime family, who turned herself into one of the most feared bosses the Camorra had ever seen. Maria Licciardi. In the spring of 1999, a shipment of unusually pure heroin arrived in Naples, and Maria Licciardi gave an order. Do not sell it. It was too strong, she said, and it would kill people. A rival clan ignored her and sold it anyway. Within days, addicts across the city began dying, and the war that followed would leave dozens dead and turn the woman who had tried to prevent it into one of the most hunted bosses in Italy. A quick clarification, because it changes how you read everything here. Maria Licciardi was not a cartel boss in the Latin American sense. She was Camorra, the Neapolitan mafia, the head of the Licciardi clan, and a leader within an alliance of families that dominated the north and center of Naples. The structure is different, the geography is different, but the principle is the same. She ran an organized crime empire, and she ran it as a woman in a world built entirely by and for men. She was born on March 24, 1951, in Secondigliano, a hard district on the edge of Naples. The Licciardi clan was founded by her brother Gennaro, and for years, Maria was not the boss. She was the sister. But then the men around her began to disappear. Gennaro died in prison in 1994, Her other brothers, Pietro and Vincenzo, were imprisoned. Her husband was imprisoned. And into that vacuum stepped Maria, becoming one of the very few women ever to lead a Camorra clan outright. What she built was remarkable, and not in a good way. She assembled a fragile coalition of around 20 clans, an alliance that controlled drugs, cigarette smuggling, extortion, counterfeit goods, and prostitution, with networks that reached into more than 20 countries. She was the glue holding rival families together, the diplomat and the strategist. They gave her nicknames. The little one for her size, the princess, and eventually the godmother. Holding 20 rival clans together is not something that happens by accident, and it is not something that happens through force alone. It takes a particular kind of mind, one that can balance egos, broker peace between families that would happily kill each other, and keep a sprawling, illegal economy running across borders. Maria did all of that in a culture that had never once allowed a woman to sit at that table. The men around her did not respect her because they were enlightened. They respected her because she was simply better at it than they were. Which brings us back to that heroine. In the spring of 1999, Maria ordered that a batch of exceptionally pure product from Istanbul be kept off the streets, precisely because it was too dangerous to use. The rival Lo Russo clan disagreed and sold it. The result was a wave of overdoses, 11 deaths in April of that year alone, a public outcry, and a brutal crackdown by police. It also shattered her alliance and triggered a war that left dozens of people dead across the city. Investigators came to suspect that Maria, the woman who had tried to stop the deaths, ordered as many as 30 killings of her own during the conflict that followed. And in January of 2001, her clan went after the state directly, bombing the office building of a prosecutor named Luigi Bobbio. This was no longer street crime. This was an organization declaring war on the institutions hunting it. By then she was a fugitive, on the run for 2 years, earning a nickname borrowed from fiction. They called her the Scarlet Pimpernel of Italy for her ability to vanish. That ended on June 14, 2001, when police finally caught her near Naples. She served 8 years and was released in 2009. A Naples prosecutor described her plainly at the time. She was a true godmother, he said, a woman who sat at the table with the other bosses, who made decisions alongside them, who operated at their exact level. But she was not finished. After evading a major anti-Camorra sweep in June of 2019, Maria became a fugitive all over again, in her late 60s. She was rearrested on August 7, 2021, at Rome's Ciampino airport, as she tried to board a flight to Spain carrying €6,000 in cash. Reporters noted that she did not so much as flinch when they took her. By then, she was 70 years old, an age when most people have long since retired, and still important enough to the Italian state that authorities tracked her movements and intercepted her at the airport before she could slip out of the country. On March 15, 2023, an Italian court found her guilty of being the leader of a Camorra clan founded by her brothers, and handed her 12 years and 8 months in prison. The charges included mafia-type association, extortion, and receiving stolen money. Italy's interior minister praised the determination of the judges and police in confronting the Camorra organizations that control such vast stretches of territory. She is incarcerated in Italy today. The author Roberto Saviano has said she inspired the female boss in his work Gomorrah, which means the woman from Secondigliano did not just lead a clan. She became the template for how the world imagines a female mafia boss at all. Licciardi held an empire together through alliances and fear. The last woman in this story rose through a brother, just like Maria did, but she ended up somewhere none of the others reached. She ended up as the only woman named in the case that finally brought down El Chapo. Guadalupe Fernandez Valencia. When American prosecutors built the case that would finally send El Chapo to prison for the rest of his life, they named dozens of his lieutenants. Only one of them was a woman. Her name was Guadalupe Fernandez Valencia, and she had climbed higher inside the Sinaloa cartel than almost any woman before her. She went by La Patrona, the boss, and she stood at sentencing and did something few people in her world ever do. She apologized. One thing to be clear about from the start: there is another woman in this story, sometimes called La Patrona, the Guatemalan, Marixa Lemus. This is not her. Guadalupe Fernandez Valencia was Mexican. She was Sinaloa cartel, and her story is entirely separate. Two women, one nickname, two completely different empires. Guadalupe Fernandez Valencia was born on October 29, 1960, in Aguililla, in the Mexican state of Michoacán. She was 60 years old by the time an American judge sentenced her, which alone makes her remarkable. This was not some young, rising enforcer. This was a woman who had spent decades in the trade. In fact, before any of this, she had already served around 10 years in California for street-level dealing in the 1990s and had been deported back to Mexico. Almost anyone else would have walked away after that. She did the opposite. She was introduced into the Sinaloa cartel by her brother Manuel, who is now serving 27 years of his own, and she rose to become one of the highest-ranking women the organization ever had. She served as a lieutenant to the Chapitos, the sons of El Chapo himself, working directly under one of them. Her job was twofold. She coordinated the movement of drugs, and she managed the flow of drug money back to Mexico, leveraging the contacts she had built during her years in California. According to her own plea agreement, the numbers were staggering. She moved an average of 30 kilograms of cocaine every week to customers around the Los Angeles area. She helped smuggle roughly 3,500 pounds of marijuana into the United States across 2009 and 2010. She moved heroin, she moved methamphetamine, and she laundered millions of dollars in the process. Those are not the numbers of a bit player. 30 kilos of cocaine a week, month after month, is a serious distribution operation in its own right. And she was running it as just one piece of a machine that stretched from the fields of Colombia to the streets of Los Angeles. She had taken a decade in an American prison and a deportation and turned them into a kind of resume, and the cartel had promoted her accordingly. All of this made her important enough to be named in the Chicago indictment, the sprawling federal case that helped put El Chapo behind bars forever. She was the only woman on it. In a cartel of thousands of men, she had become significant enough that the United States government listed her by name alongside the most powerful traffickers in the hemisphere. The walls closed in fast. She had been indicted in Chicago in 2013. The United States Treasury added her to its kingpin list in November of 2015, and in February of 2016, just a month after El Chapo's final capture, she was arrested in Culiacán, in the heart of Sinaloa. In November of 2017, she was extradited to Chicago to answer for all of it. In June of 2019, she pleaded guilty to drug trafficking and money laundering conspiracies. And then, like Cotton and like Dignavale before her, she made the choice to cooperate. She provided what prosecutors called substantial assistance, and she did it knowing the cost. Cooperating with the Americans put her own life in danger, and the lives of her 5 children, in a world where that kind of betrayal is answered with blood. On August 24, 2021, she was sentenced to 10 years. And the sentencing itself was unlike almost anything else in this story. Through an interpreter, she spoke to the judge directly. She said she wanted to use the moment to ask forgiveness from her children and from her family, and that she wished she could find the words to convince the court how sorry she truly was. The judge, who called the Sinaloa cartel an evil enterprise, acknowledged that her cooperation had come at real risk to herself and to those 5 children. Because of that cooperation and the 8 years she had already spent in detention, she walked free in October of 2023. As a foreign national, she faced deportation back to Mexico, a country where many of her former associates remain free and where a known cooperator is never truly safe. Whether she was actually deported or quietly placed into some form of protection has never been made clear. So she vanished, in the end, the same way she had risen, quietly on her own terms, the only woman named in the case against the most famous drug lord alive, the boss who looked a federal judge in the eye and asked her family to forgive her. 8 women, from a Naples housing block to the mountains of Honduras, who proved that the deadliest people in organized crime were never only the men. Some are buried in prison cells for the rest of their lives, and at least one of them may still be running her empire as you watch this. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.